Edward walked into the shelter that autumn afternoon believing it would be just another visit. But when his eyes met Blue's, a black Labrador huddled in the corner of the room, everything around him seemed to disappear. Blue didn't bark, didn't move, just stared at him with a gaze so deep and full of longing that it seemed to plead, "Don't forget me." In that instant Edward knew his life would change forever. Little did he know that this meeting would not only fill the emptiness in his heart, but would soon reveal the true meaning of unconditional love between a man and his four-legged guardian angel. Edward had always been a man of routine. At 75, retirement had left him with too much free time, and the house he had shared with his wife Eleanor in the quiet suburbs of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, now seemed immense and empty. The constant silence made memories of a past he could no longer reach echo through the rooms. The morning coffee tasted different when prepared for one, and the evening news felt hollow without Eleanor's gentle commentary about the day's events. His children lived far away, busy with their own families and careers. His son Michael worked as an engineer in Denver, while his daughter Sarah had moved to Phoenix with her husband and two teenage grandchildren Edward barely knew. Visits were rare and brief, and Edward felt the weight of loneliness growing heavier with each passing day. He tried to distract himself by reading the Cedar Rapids Gazette, watching his old westerns on television, or tending to Eleanor's rose garden. But nothing filled that void that seemed to expand like the Iowa horizon. The house on Maple Street, with its white picket fence and wraparound porch where he and Eleanor used to sit watching sunsets, now felt more like a museum than a home. Eleanor's reading glasses still sat on the kitchen counter, next to her favorite coffee mug, the one with tiny blue flowers that she'd bought at the farmer's market years ago. Her gardening gloves lay exactly where she'd left them by the back door, still holding the faint scent of soil and the lavender hand cream she used to apply every evening. It was on a gray autumn morning, while listening to WHO radio as he ate his solitary breakfast of toast and scrambled eggs, that Edward heard the announcement from the Lynn County Animal Shelter about dogs available for adoption. Something stirred within him, an impulse, a sudden need for connection that made him set down his coffee cup and reach for his coat. Maybe a dog, he thought, fingering the worn leather wallet that still held Eleanor's last grocery list. A friend to share my days, or two. The drive to the shelter took him through neighborhoods he and Eleanor used to explore on their Sunday drives, past the old Bruce Moore mansion where they'd attended summer concerts, through downtown Cedar Rapids, where they'd shopped at local stores that had long since been replaced by chain retailers, and finally to the industrial area near the Cedar River, where the animal shelter stood like a beacon of hope for abandoned souls. Upon arriving at the shelter, Edward was greeted by the overwhelming mixture of sounds and smells, the sharp scent of disinfectant trying to mask the earthier odors of animals, the cacophony of barks, whines, and the hurried footsteps of volunteers going about their daily routines. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves from nearby yards, reminding him of the countless fall days he and Eleanor had spent raking their own yard, working together in comfortable silence. There were dogs of all ages, sizes, and colors filling the kennels. Puppies tumbled over each other in playful heaps, their tiny paws scrabbling against the concrete floors. Young adult dogs pressed their faces against the chain-link fencing, tails wagging frantically as potential adopters walked by. But it was Blue who immediately captured Edward's attention, sitting quietly in kennel number 12, as if he had been waiting specifically for this moment. Blue was positioned in the far corner of his kennel, his black coat slightly dusty, and his eyes carrying a melancholy that seemed beyond his years. Most people walked past, drawn to the more energetic dogs or the adorable puppies that jumped and played for attention. But Edward stopped as if pulled by an invisible thread, his worn work boots planted firmly on the concrete floor as he studied this dignified animal. The Labrador's gaze was intense and knowing, as if he recognized Edward from some previous life or shared dream. As Edward approached the kennel, he felt a sharp tug in his chest, a mixture of sadness and empathy that reminded him of looking in the mirror some mornings. "You're alone too, aren't you, boy?" he murmured softly, and something in that moment created an unbreakable bond between them. Blue tilted his head slightly, his ears perking up at Edward's gentle tone, but remained perfectly still, watching Edward's face with complete attention and what seemed like profound understanding. A young shelter worker named Katie, her red hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her uniform bearing the stains of a day spent caring for animals, approached Edward with a warm smile. She explained that Blue had been surrendered several months ago when his previous owner, an elderly farmer from nearby Marion, had been forced into a nursing home after a stroke. "Nobody's shown much interest in him," Katie said sadly, scratching Blue's ears through the fencing. "People want puppies or younger dogs, but Blue here, he's special. He's got the gentlest soul you'll ever find, and he seems to understand when people are hurting." Edward felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, but alongside it came something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose. He knew without hesitation that this magnificent creature was meant to be his companion. The decision felt as natural as breathing, as right as the morning sun rising over the cornfields that surrounded Cedar Rapids. The adoption process took the better part of the afternoon. Edward patiently filled out forms, answered questions about his living situation, provided references, and discussed Blue's medical history and behavioral patterns with the shelter staff. Each signature brought him closer to bringing Blue home, and with each step he felt a growing excitement that reminded him of Christmas mornings from his childhood in rural Minnesota. Katie led Edward to a small visiting room where he could spend time with Blue away from the noise and distractions of the main kennel area. The room was simply furnished with a worn blue couch, a few dog toys scattered on the linoleum floor, and a large window that looked out onto a small yard where other prospective adopters were getting to know their potential new family members. When Blue was brought into the room, he surveyed his surroundings with calm dignity before approaching Edward slowly, deliberately. Edward knelt down to the dog's level, extending his weathered hand for Blue to sniff. The Labrador's wet nose was cool against Edward's palm, and after a moment of careful assessment, Blue stepped closer and gently placed his head against Edward's chest. The contact was electric, not in a jarring way, but like the completion of a circuit that had been broken for too long. Edward wrapped his arms around Blue's sturdy frame, feeling the dog's warmth seep through his flannel shirt and directly into the cold places in his heart. Blue's tail gave a tentative wag, and Edward could swear he felt the animal sigh with relief. "Well, Blue," Edward whispered into the dog's soft ear, "I think we're going to be just fine together." What? When the final paperwork was signed and Blue's new collar and leash were secured, Edward felt a mixture of nervous anticipation and profound gratitude. Blue seemed to sense the significance of the moment, walking calmly beside Edward as they made their way to the parking lot where his old Ford pickup truck waited under the gray October sky. The drive home through the familiar streets of Cedar Rapids took on new meaning with Blue sitting quietly in the passenger seat, his nose pressed against the partially open window, taking in all the scents of his new neighborhood. Edward found himself narrating the journey, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories, as if Blue could understand every word. "That's Murphy's hardware store where Eleanor and I used to buy our gardening supplies," he said as they stopped at a red light. "And over there is the library where she volunteered every Tuesday for 15 years. Blue listened attentively, occasionally turning his head to look at Edward with those expressive dark eyes that seemed to absorb every word and store it away for future reference. When they pulled into the driveway of the modest two-story house on Maple Street, Blue waited patiently for Edward to come around and open his door, demonstrating the kind of good manners that spoke of careful training and a gentle nature. The house seemed different with Blue in it, less like a shrine to the past and more like a place where life was about to begin again. Edward had prepared for this moment by setting up a comfortable dog bed in the living room near his favorite recliner, the one where he spent most of his evenings reading the newspaper or watching television. He had also purchased food and water bowls, which he placed in the kitchen near the window that looked out onto Eleanor's rose garden. Blue explored his new environment with careful thoroughness, his nose leading him from room to room as he catalogued the scents and sounds of his new home. He paused at the foot of the stairs leading to the second floor, looking questioningly at Edward, who nodded his permission. "Go ahead, boy. This is your home now, too." The dog's exploration was methodical and respectful. He sniffed around Eleanor's chair at the kitchen table, investigated the corners where her knitting basket still sat, filled with half-finished projects, and paused for a long moment in the doorway of Edward's bedroom, where Eleanor's perfume bottle still graced the dresser and her side of the bed remained untouched. That first evening, as Edward prepared a simple dinner of pot roast and vegetables, a meal that had been Eleanor's specialty, Blue positioned himself on the braided rug in the kitchen doorway, where he could observe his new human without getting in the way. The familiar sounds of cooking filled the kitchen with warmth. The gentle sizzle of onions in the cast-iron skillet Eleanor had received as a wedding gift, the rhythmic chopping of carrots on the wooden cutting board she'd used for decades, and the soft bubbling of gravy simmering on the back burner. Edward found himself humming as he cooked, an old Johnny Cash song that had been one of Eleanor's favorites. Blue's ears perked up at the sound, and his tail thumped softly against the floor, as if he approved of this return to melody in a house that had been too quiet for too long. After dinner, which Blue ate with polite enthusiasm from his new bowl, the two settled into what would become their evening routine. Edward took his usual place in the living room recliner with the day's Gazette and a cup of coffee, while Blue stretched out on the rug nearby, close enough that Edward could reach down and scratch behind his ears whenever the mood struck. The companionable silence was different from the loneliness Edward had experienced for months. This was a shared quietude, filled with the comforting sounds of Blue's steady breathing and the occasional thump of his tail when Edward spoke to him. It was the kind of peace that comes from knowing you're not alone, that another living being shares your space and cares about your well-being. As the days turned into weeks, Edward and Blue developed their own rhythm of life together. Their mornings began with a walk through the neighborhood, Edward setting a leisurely pace that allowed Blue to investigate the fascinating world of scents along their route. They would stroll past the Hendersons' house, where Mrs. Henderson would wave from her kitchen window and sometimes bring out treats for Blue, and continue down to Knoll Ridge Park, where other early morning dog walkers gathered near the small pond. Blue seemed to understand instinctively that Edward's pace was deliberate rather than limited, born not from physical restriction, but from a newfound appreciation for the simple pleasure of being present in each moment. The dog would wait patiently when Edward stopped to chat with neighbors, his tail wagging gently as he received attention from the growing number of people who were beginning to recognize the distinguished pair. There was Bob Martinez, a retired machinist who walked his elderly beagle along the same route each morning and who shared Edward's love of baseball and memories of better times. "That's a fine dog you've got there, Edward," Bob would say, offering Blue a scratch behind the ears. "He's got character, that one. You can see it in his eyes." Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down would often be tending her flower garden when they passed, and she made a habit of having dog biscuits ready in her apron pocket. "Blue brings out the best in you, Edward," she observed one morning in late October, as golden leaves swirled around their feet. "Eleanor would be so pleased to see you smiling again." Their daily walks became a cornerstone of Edward's return to life. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs with purpose, and Blue's steady presence beside him made even the most mundane errands feel like adventures. They would walk to the post office to collect mail, stop by Thompson's corner store for groceries, and take longer routes through residential areas where Blue could examine all the fascinating scents left by other dogs and wildlife. The afternoons were spent in comfortable companionship around the house. Edward would work in Eleanor's garden, carefully tending the roses she had loved so much, while Blue supervised from a shady spot under the old oak tree that had stood in their backyard for over 50 years. Sometimes Edward would read aloud from the newspaper, sharing stories about local events or commenting on the weather forecast, and Blue would listen with the same attention he might have given to a favorite radio program. But it was during the quiet evening hours that Edward felt the deepest connection with his new companion. After dinner, they would settle in the living room, Edward in his recliner with a book or magazine, Blue stretched out on the rug nearby, occasionally lifting his head when Edward's voice grew emotional during particularly moving passages or interesting news stories. Edward had begun reading aloud from some of Eleanor's favorite novels, books that had sat untouched on the shelf since her passing. Blue seemed to enjoy these evening reading sessions, his ears perking up at the different voices Edward would create for various characters, and his tail giving an appreciative thump when Edward reached exciting or touching moments in the stories. One evening in early November, as the first hints of winter began to creep into the Iowa air, and frost warned of colder days ahead, Edward was reading from Old Yeller, a book Eleanor had loved for its portrayal of the bond between a boy and his dog, when Blue suddenly rose from his place on the rug and approached Edward's chair. The dog placed his head on Edward's lap and looked up with such intensity that Edward set aside his reading glasses and the worn paperback book. Blue's dark eyes held an expression of deep concern, and he made a soft sound that wasn't quite a whine, but something more complex, as if he were trying to communicate something vitally important. Edward stroked Blue's head, puzzled by this unusual behavior, but touched by the obvious care in those expressive eyes. "What is it, boy? Do you need to go outside?" But Blue made no move toward the door. Instead, he seemed to be studying Edward's face, with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for reading the most important news. "I'm fine, Blue," Edward assured him, though he had been feeling more tired than usual lately, and had noticed a persistent ache in his chest that he'd attributed to the changing weather and the physical activity of their daily walks. "Just a little worn out from our long walk today." The next morning brought an unexpected challenge that would test the bond Edward and Blue had forged over their weeks together. Edward woke feeling dizzy and nauseous, symptoms he initially attributed to the previous evening's hearty beef stew that might have been a bit too rich for his aging digestive system. But as he attempted to rise from bed to let Blue out for his morning routine, a sharp, crushing pain shot through his chest, leaving him gasping and clutching the nightstand for support. Blue, who had been sleeping on his bed beside Edward's, a privilege that had evolved naturally over their weeks together, immediately sprang into high alert. The dog pressed close to Edward's side, providing steady, warm support as his human struggled to regain his composure and understand what was happening to his body. When Edward attempted to stand and immediately collapsed back onto the bed, his face pale and sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool November morning, Blue's response was immediate and purposeful. The dog left Edward's side only long enough to grab the cordless telephone from the nightstand in his mouth, carrying it carefully to Edward's trembling hands with a kind of trained precision that spoke of intelligence far beyond typical canine understanding. As Edward dialed 911 with fingers that seemed to move independently of his will, his voice weak but clear as he gave his address to the emergency dispatcher, Blue positioned himself as a living pillow, allowing Edward to lean against his sturdy, reassuring frame. The dog's warmth and steady breathing provided an anchor of calm in the midst of Edward's growing fear. "This is Edward Williams at 1247 Maple Street," he whispered into the phone, his words punctuated by sharp intakes of breath. I think I'm having a heart attack." The next few minutes stretched into what felt like hours, filled with the distant sound of sirens growing closer, the urgent voices of paramedics, and throughout it all the steady, calming presence of Blue, who refused to leave Edward's side, even when the emergency medical team arrived and began their life-saving work. Blue watched with intelligent concern as the paramedics checked Edward's vital signs, started an IV line, and prepared him for a transport to Mercy Medical Center. When they lifted Edward onto the stretcher, Blue followed as closely as the medical team would allow, his eyes never leaving his human's face. At the ambulance, when the paramedics explained that Blue couldn't ride with them, the dog sat in the driveway and watched until the flashing lights disappeared around the corner of Maple Street, then returned to the house to begin his vigil of waiting. At Mercy Medical Center, Dr. Jennifer Chen confirmed Edward's fears. He had indeed suffered a heart attack, though thankfully not a severe one. The next several days would be crucial for monitoring his heart function and determining the best course of treatment. As Edward lay in the cardiac care unit, connected to monitors that beeped with reassuring regularity, his thoughts kept returning to Blue. "Is there someone who can check on your dog?" asked his nurse, a kind woman named Susan, whose gentle manner reminded Edward of Eleanor's natural way with people who were hurting. Edward's heart sank as he considered his limited options. His son Michael was dealing with a major project deadline in Denver and couldn't leave immediately. His daughter Sarah was managing her own family crisis in Phoenix. Her teenager had been in a minor car accident and needed her attention. His few close friends were dealing with their own age-related challenges, and he hated to burden his neighbors with such a significant responsibility. "There's no one close enough," he admitted, his voice heavy with worry. "He's all alone in the house, and he doesn't understand why I haven't come home." But Edward had underestimated the community he and Blue had quietly built during their morning walks through the neighborhood. When Bob Martinez's beagle became restless during their usual walk and led him to Edward's house, Bob found Blue sitting by the front window, his nose pressed against the glass, his entire body radiating distress and confusion. The absence of Edward's truck in the driveway and Blue's obvious anxiety told Bob everything he needed to know. Using the spare key Edward had given him months ago for emergencies, a gesture of trust between neighbors that had seemed routine at the time, Bob let himself into the house to care for Blue. But Blue's loyal heart was clearly breaking with each passing hour. He refused to eat his food, barely touched his water, and spent most of his time lying by the front door or sitting at the living room window, watching for any sign of Edward's return. His usual dignified composure had given way to a restless anxiety that spoke of a bond deeper than simple pet attachment. Mrs. Patterson, Bob Martinez, and several other neighbors from their morning walking route took turns checking on Blue, but the dog's faithful spirit was clearly suffering. He moved through the house like a shadow of his former self, pausing at Edward's favorite chair where the scent of his human still lingered, sleeping on the rug beside Edward's bed and carrying one of Edward's slippers in his mouth wherever he went, a behavior that broke the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. Ms. Henderson, who had developed a special fondness for Blue during their daily encounters, brought homemade chicken soup and tried to coax him to eat, but Blue showed little interest in food or comfort from anyone other than Edward. His bright, intelligent eyes had dulled with worry, and he had already begun to lose weight from his poor appetite and constant anxiety. On the 4th day of Edward's hospitalization, when his condition had stabilized enough for him to have visitors, Michael finally arrived from Denver, having rearranged his work schedule to be with his father. Bob Martinez met him at Edward's house to explain the situation, and when Michael saw Blue's condition, the way the dog's usually glossy coat had lost its shine, how he'd grown thin from barely eating, and most heartbreakingly, how he looked at Michael with hope that immediately faded when he realized this wasn't Edward. He understood that this was more than typical pet behavior. "He's grieving," Michael told Bob, his voice thick with emotion, as he watched Blue return to his post at the window, just like Dad did when Mom died. "They have a connection I didn't fully understand until now." That evening, Michael made a decision that would forever change how he viewed the relationship between his father and the dog he had initially seen as merely a pet. He drove to Mercy Medical Center and spoke with Dr. Chen, explaining the situation and advocating for a special visit that might benefit both patient and devoted companion. Dr. Chen, initially hesitant due to hospital policies about animals in patient care areas, was moved by Michael's passionate description of the bond between Edward and Blue, and the obvious deterioration both man and dog were experiencing due to their separation. After consulting with the hospital administration and obtaining special permission, she agreed to allow a brief visit under controlled circumstances. The next morning, Michael arrived at the hospital with Blue on a leash, the Labrador's entire demeanor transformed by the familiar hospital smells and sounds that suggested Edward might be nearby. As they rode the elevator to the cardiac floor, Blue's tail began to wag for the first time in 5 days, and his ears perked up with anticipation that was almost palpable. When they reached Edward's room on the 4th floor, Blue's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. He strained against the leash with barely contained joy, his entire body trembling with excitement and relief. Edward, who had been listlessly picking at his breakfast tray and staring out the window at the gray November sky, looked up to see his beloved companion and felt tears streaming down his cheeks. "Blue! Oh, my boy, you came!" Edward's voice broke with emotion as Blue rushed to his bedside, the dog's professional training forgotten in his desperate need to reconnect with his human. The reunion was witnessed by the entire nursing staff, many of whom found themselves wiping away tears as they watched Blue carefully position himself beside Edward's hospital bed, resting his head on the white blanket where Edward could easily reach him. The monitors that had been showing Edward's elevated stress levels and irregular heart rhythms began to normalize almost immediately, displaying the kind of physiological improvement that medical textbooks described, but doctors rarely witnessed so dramatically. Dr. Chen, observing from the doorway with Michael, was amazed by the immediate changes in her patient. Edward's blood pressure dropped to healthier levels. His breathing became deeper and more relaxed, and for the first time since his admission, he showed genuine interest in eating his breakfast and following his prescribed treatment plan. "This is remarkable," Dr. Chen murmured to Michael. "I've read studies about the therapeutic benefits of animal companionship, but I've never seen such a dramatic and immediate response in a cardiac patient." Over the next 2 days, with special permission from the hospital administration and under the careful supervision of the medical staff, Blue became Edward's constant companion and unofficial therapy dog. He remained calm and gentle despite the unfamiliar hospital environment, the strange sounds of medical equipment, and the constant stream of staff members coming and going. The dog seemed to understand instinctively that Edward needed quiet support rather than playful energy. Blue's presence had an unexpected effect on the other patients in the cardiac care unit as well. The golden-hearted Labrador, with his innate gentleness and perceptive nature, somehow knew which patients needed his attention most. During Edward's nap times, Blue would make quiet visits to other rooms, offering comfort to patients who were facing their own health challenges and missing their own pets and families. Mr. Thompson, a 78-year-old farmer recovering from bypass surgery, later told his family that Blue's visit was the first time he had smiled since his operation. The dog had somehow sensed his homesickness for his own cattle dog back on the farm and had spent 20 minutes letting him tell stories about his life, raising corn and soybeans, responding with gentle tail wags and understanding nods at all the appropriate moments. Mrs. Rodriguez, a 69-year-old grandmother who had suffered a mild stroke, found comfort in Blue's patient presence during her physical therapy sessions. The dog would lie quietly beside her wheelchair, offering silent encouragement as she worked to regain her speech and motor functions, and seemed to celebrate her small victories with enthusiastic but gentle tail wagging. When Edward was finally cleared for discharge after a week in the hospital, the entire cardiac team gathered to say goodbye to their most unusual therapy volunteer. Blue accepted their pats and kind words with gracious dignity, but his focus remained entirely on Edward, staying close enough that his human could feel the reassuring warmth of his presence with every step toward recovery and home. The ride home through the familiar streets of Cedar Rapids was quiet, both Edward and Blue seeming to understand that they had been given a precious gift, more time together, and a deeper appreciation for the bond they shared. As they pulled into the driveway on Maple Street, Blue's tail began its gentle rhythm of contentment, and Edward felt his heart fill with gratitude for this second chance at happiness. That evening, as they settled back into their comfortable routine, Edward in his recliner with a cup of herbal tea instead of coffee, following his new cardiac diet, and Blue on his rug nearby, Edward reflected on the events of the past week. He realized that in saving Blue from a life of waiting in the animal shelter, Blue had ultimately saved him from something far more dangerous, a life without purpose, love, or hope. "You know, Blue," Edward said softly, reaching down to stroke the dog's ears, "I thought I was rescuing you that day at the shelter, but it turns out you were rescuing me right back." Blue's response was a gentle thump of his tail against the hardwood floor and a soft sigh of pure contentment. In the warm glow of the table lamp, surrounded by the familiar comforts of home and the steady presence of unconditional love, Edward Williams understood that some of life's most profound gifts come disguised as ordinary moments of grace. The weeks that followed Edward's recovery were filled with a renewed appreciation for the simple rhythms of daily life. Their morning walks became more precious, each sunrise a reminder that they had been given extra time together. Blue seemed to sense Edward's vulnerability during those first weeks at home, staying closer than usual and displaying an almost supernatural awareness of his human's physical and emotional needs. Their story spread throughout the neighborhood and eventually reached the local newspaper, the Cedar Rapids Gazette, where a young reporter named Emma discovered their tale through Mrs. Patterson, who had called to suggest a feature story about the healing power of pet adoption for senior citizens. "It's never too late to find love," Edward told Emma during the interview, Blue lying contentedly at his feet in their living room. "And sometimes the love that saves you comes on 4 legs with a wagging tail and a heart big enough to heal all your broken places." What? The article, titled "The Last Embrace, a Love Story Between Man and Dog," was published on a Sunday morning in December, accompanied by a photo of Edward and Blue sitting together on their front porch, both wearing red scarves that Mrs. Henderson had knitted for them as an early Christmas gift. The image captured something timeless about the bond between humans and animals, the way love can find us when we need it most, and transform our lives in ways we never expected. If you've ever experienced the healing power of an animal's love, or if you know someone who might benefit from the kind of companionship that Blue provided for Edward, take a moment to share that story. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is acknowledging that they're never too old for new beginnings, new love, and new purpose. The love between Edward and Blue continued to inspire their community long after the newspaper article was forgotten. They became a symbol of hope for anyone who believed their best years were behind them, proving that love has no expiration date and that sometimes our greatest adventures begin when we think our story is coming to an end. Please share this story with someone who might need to hear it today, and don't forget to let me know in the comments about the special animals in your life. Their stories of loyalty, love, and healing remind us all of what truly matters, and I'd love to hear how a four-legged friend has touched your heart. Until next time, remember that love always finds a way, and sometimes it arrives when we need it most. Wearing fur and carrying a leash, ready to walk beside us into whatever tomorrow holds.